The folks in Copper Creek had a name for Martha Brennan. They called her the Ghost of the Mountain. For 7 long years, she'd lived up on that slope, alone, after fever took her husband James and their 3 children. She was 38, but the town whispered she looked 100. They said she never spoke a word more than she had to, that her eyes were as gray and cold as the winter sky. When she came to town for supplies, the women would pull their shawls tighter, and the men would stop talking. They saw a widow. They saw a woman who had lost everything, but they were wrong. Martha Brennan wasn't just a widow. She was a guardian, and she was guarding a secret worth more than the whole valley. A secret people had already killed for once, and were getting ready to kill for again. The first frost had just laid a silver blanket on the world when she saw the riders, Tom Harper and his boy, Luke. Tom had tried to court her once, right after James died. She'd sent him packing. Now he was reined in at the edge of her property, his face tight with a worry that wasn't neighborly. "Afternoon, Mrs. Brennan," he called out, but he didn't tip his hat. Martha didn't put down her axe. "Mr. Harper." "Just checking the fence line," he said, but his eyes were scanning the tree line behind her cabin, like he was looking for someone. "Figured I'd see if you needed anything before the snows hit proper." "I manage," she said. The words were flat, a stone wall. Tom's horse shifted, uneasy. "Ma'am, the new preacher, Reverend Dalton, he's been stirring folks up." Martha's knuckles went white on the axe handle. She knew all about the Reverend. "He says it ain't right, a woman living alone. Says you're improper. My life is my business." "Not anymore, it ain't," Tom said, his voice dropping low. "The men have been drinking. Roy Patterson, Jed Hawkins. They're talking about coming up here to look after you, whether you want it or not." It wasn't a warning, it was a threat, delivered by a messenger who was trying to look like a friend. Martha's jaw set like iron. "I've got a Henry rifle, Mr. Harper. Any man comes here uninvited will learn that soon enough." Tom looked at her, a long, strange look. It wasn't pity. It was something else, something that looked a lot like fear. "Fair enough," he said, and finally touched the brim of his hat. "Just remember, there's friends in this valley, if you ever need 'em." He rode off, leaving Martha standing in the cold, the axe heavy in her hand. She wasn't afraid of drunks like Roy Patterson. She wasn't afraid of a preacher thumping his Bible. She was afraid of what they really wanted, because she knew it had nothing to do with her being a widow, and everything to do with what James had found deep in the earth, just days before the fever took him. That night the storm hit. It came down from the peaks not like weather, but like a judgment. The wind screamed like a dying thing, and the snow came down so thick it was like the world had vanished. Martha bolted her door, checked the action on her rifle, and sat by the fire listening. She knew the storm was a cover. Men could move in this weather, unseen, unheard. Meanwhile, 4 miles away, Samuel McKenna was fighting for his life. Folks called him a hard man. He'd buried his own wife and daughter 8 years back, and a part of him had been buried with them. His life was cattle and fences and a silence as deep as a grave. When the storm broke, it hit his ranch with the force of a locomotive. The wind tore the doors off his barn, and his best horse, Buck, bolted into the White Fury. Sam didn't think. He just went. You don't let a good horse die in a blizzard, but the storm was a living monster. It blinded him, deafened him. He found Buck, shivering and terrified, but by then he was lost. His ranch, his world, everything was gone, swallowed by the snow. The cold was a physical thing, a giant hand squeezing the life from his bones. He was going to die out here. Just as the last of his strength gave out, just as he was ready to lie down and let the snow take him, he smelled it. Wood smoke. Faint, but it was there. He staggered toward the smell, dragging the horse, his legs like blocks of ice. And then he saw it. A single golden square of light in the endless, roaring dark. A cabin. He hammered on the door with fists that had lost all feeling. "Help!" he croaked, his voice raw. The door creaked open, and he found himself staring down the barrel of a rifle, held by the ghost of the mountain. Martha Brennan stared at the man on her doorstep. He was more ice than man, his beard crusted with snow, his eyes wide with the desperate look of a creature about to die. But she saw something else too. She saw the brand on his horse's flank. The double M Samuel McKenna, a man who kept to himself even more than she did. A man the town left alone. He wasn't one of Dalton's cronies. This was something else. This was fate kicking her door down. Please, he managed to whisper through frozen lips. Her eyes, which the town called cold, softened just a fraction. She lowered the rifle. Get in here, she said, her voice rough. Before you're dead on my porch. She pulled him inside, then wrestled his horse into the small lean-to, the wind tearing at her, trying to rip the door from her hands. When she got back inside, Sam was slumped in the chair by the fire, shaking so hard the floorboards rattled. She didn't ask questions. She worked. She forced a cup of coffee laced with whiskey into his hands. The heat hit his gut like a branding iron. My horse, he rasped, got loose. You're a fool for following it, she said. But there was no heat in her words, just fact. Another 10 minutes and you'd be a statue. His fingers were too numb to work the laces of his boots. She knelt without a word and pulled them off for him. His feet were white, dead-looking. She started rubbing them, hard, forcing the life back in. This is going to hurt, she warned. She was right. Pain exploded through him, sharp as 1,000 needles. He gritted his teeth, his knuckles white on the arms of the chair. But he didn't cry out. She worked with a practiced calm, her hands sure and steady. The hands of a woman who knew sickness. The hands of a woman who had tended to the dying. When she was done, she pointed to a trunk in the corner. There are clothes in there. My husband's. Change. He hesitated. It felt like a violation, wearing a dead man's clothes. But his own were frozen solid. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. The clothes were clean, smelling of cedar and old memories. When he came back to the fire, she had a bowl of hot stew waiting. Eat, she commanded. He ate. It was the best thing he'd ever tasted. He looked around the small cabin. It was one room, but neat as a pin. Herbs hanging from the rafters, a small shelf of books, a simple calico curtain hiding the bed. It was a woman's home, but it felt strong, like a fortress. Your horse is fine, she said after a long silence, her voice seeming to come from the shadows. Gave him some grain. Thank you, he said. The words felt small, useless. For everything. You were dying, she replied, her gaze steady. I wouldn't turn a wolf away in this storm. He shifted, uncomfortable. I should. I can sleep in the lean-to with the horse. I've imposed enough. For the first time, something like a smile touched her lips, but it was a grim, tired thing. That lean-to can barely hold your horse. You'd be frozen by midnight. Don't be a fool twice in one night, Mr. McKenna. Then I'll take the floor, he insisted. Her voice cut through his protest, sharp as her axe. We are both widowed, and we are both well past the age of foolish games. You will sleep in the bed. She pulled back the calico curtain, revealing a wide bed, neatly made. She paused, then turned back to him. Her next words hung in the air, shocking in their practicality. There's room enough for two. It's just sleep, nothing more. He felt a flush of heat climb his neck, but he couldn't argue. To die for the sake of appearances seemed the most foolish thing of all. She laid a thick quilt right down the middle of the mattress. The Continental Divide, she said, her voice dry as dust. You stay on your side, I'll stay on mine. So they lay there side by side, two strangers separated by a line of cloth, while the storm raged outside. The bed was heavy with the presence of another person. He could hear her breathing, slow and steady. And for the first time in 8 years, Samuel McKenna was not alone in the dark. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the ceiling. The wind howled, but inside the small cabin, a strange quiet had fallen. My wife, Clara, Sam's voice was a low whisper in the darkness. And our little girl, Sarah. A buggy accident. The horse spooked. 8 years ago. He hadn't said their names out loud to another soul in years. The silence stretched, and he thought maybe she hadn't heard. Then her voice came from her side of the quilt, just as soft. My James, and my 2 boys and my little girl. The fever took them all inside of a week. 7 years passed. They lay there, 2 ghosts in a bed. Their shared grief, a tangible thing in the room. A third person, woven from loss. Why? Sam asked, the question breaking the fragile peace. Why do you stay up here, alone? He felt her shift in the darkness. For the same reason you bury yourself in cattle and fences, I expect, she said. Her voice had a raw edge now. It's easier. Easier than what, he wondered. Easier than risking it all again? He closed his eyes. Her words struck a chord deep inside him, a place he thought had died with his family. Easier, yes. But lying here, next to this stranger who had saved his life, he wondered for the first time if easy was the same thing as living. The storm was a monster, but it had forced him here. It had breached the walls he'd built around himself, and it had breached hers too. Sleep, Mr. McKenna, she murmured, her voice sounding weary now. Tomorrow the storm will pass. You'll go back to your life, and I'll go back to mine. He lay awake long after her breathing evened out into the rhythm of sleep. He had survived the blizzard, but he had a strange, unsettling feeling that the real storm was just beginning, and it had nothing to do with the weather. Morning came, quiet and blindingly white. The world was reborn in snow. They moved around each other in the small cabin with a strange, unspoken rhythm. He helped her milk the cow and feed the chickens, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The work was a comfort. It didn't require words, and words were dangerous things right now. By midday, a path was clear enough. Sam saddled Buck, the horse looking no worse for the wear. The time had come to leave. The world was intruding again. Thank you, he said, pulling on his coat. The words still felt inadequate. For the fire, for saving my life. Martha just looked at him, her gray eyes unreadable. Don't thank me, Sam McKenna. Thank the storm. It's the only reason you ever would have crossed my doorstep. He tipped his hat, swung into the saddle, and rode away. He didn't look back, but he could feel her eyes on him until the trees hid him from view. He thought that was the end of it. He was wrong. Copper Creek was a small town, a town that fed on whispers, and a lonely rancher spending a night in the Ghost of the Mountains cabin during a blizzard. That was a feast. By the time Sam rode into town for supplies, the story had already grown legs and claws. He walked into Muller's store, and the whispers followed him like flies. The Brennan woman finally got herself a man. Storm was just an excuse, I tell you. Reverend Dalton, a man with a face like a clenched fist and eyes that burned with holy fire, took to the pulpit that Sunday. He didn't use names. He didn't have to. He thundered about sin and scandal, about Jezebels luring good men from the path of righteousness. The town soaked it up. Some of the men like Roy Patterson and Jed Hawkins, laughed crude jokes at the saloon. They muttered about how a woman like that, a woman living outside the rules, needed to be put in her place. Tom Harper found Sam outside the church, his face grim. It's getting ugly, Sam, he said, not meeting his eyes. Dalton's got them convinced she's a blight on this valley. They're saying if she won't choose a husband to keep her proper, they'll choose one for her. Sam's blood ran cold. They're threatening her? Not with word, Tom said, finally looking at him. Not yet. Sam didn't even say goodbye. He got on his horse and rode. He rode straight for the mountain. Martha was splitting firewood when he arrived, the rhythmic crack of the axe echoing in the cold air. She didn't stop when he rode up. She looked tired, he thought. There were new lines of strain around her eyes. I figured you'd hear the talk, she said, slamming the axe into the chopping block. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. I came to apologize, Sam said, swinging down from Buck. I brought this trouble to you. She finally looked at him, her eyes flashing with a familiar fire. You didn't bring anything, McKenna. Trouble was already on its way. You just gave it an excuse to knock. The wall was back up, higher and thicker than before. Has anyone been up here? He asked, his gut tight. Seen a few riders watching from the trees, she admitted, her voice tight. Dalton's dogs, sniffing around. You can't face this alone, Martha. Don't you dare, she snapped, pointing a finger at him. Don't you dare make this your fight. I opened my door to a dying man. That's all that happened. This is my land, my problem. He stood his ground. If you want me to leave, I'll go. But if they come for you, I'm standing with you." She stared at him, a long, hard stare. Her pride was warring with something else, something that looked like fear. At last she let out a long breath, and some of the fight seemed to go out of her. "If you're so determined to make yourself useful," she said, gesturing with her head, "that fence on the back acre needs mending." It was a surrender, or maybe an invitation. They worked side by side all afternoon. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. The steady rhythm of the work was its own conversation. He drove the posts. She held them steady. It felt right, frighteningly so. But the peace was shattered when three riders emerged from the trees: Jed Hawkins, Carl Brenner, and young Roy Patterson, his face twisted in a smug sneer. The dogs had been let off the leash. "Afternoon, Mrs. Brennan," Hawkins called out, his voice oily. "Just came to see if you were managing." Martha didn't flinch. "I've managed 7 years without your help, Jed." Roy Patterson spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Reverend says it ain't fitting. A woman on her own, especially after recent events." His eyes slid over to Sam, filled with a greasy, knowing look. Sam felt a hot rage build in his chest. He tightened his grip on the post hammer. But Martha spoke first, her voice clear and cold as a mountain spring. "I live my life proper, Roy Patterson. If your reverend thinks different, that's a stain on his soul, not mine." "You need a husband," Roy sneered, taking a step forward. "Someone to keep you on the right path. And if you won't choose one for yourself—" The rest of his sentence was swallowed by the deafening crack of a rifle. Snow kicked up an inch from Roy's boot. He froze, his eyes wide. Martha stood by the cabin door, the Henry rifle resting easily in her hands. "The next one won't be a warning," she said, her voice calm as a frozen lake. The men's bluster evaporated. Hawkins muttered something about not wanting trouble. Brenner was already turning his horse. Only Roy Patterson held his ground for a moment longer, his face a mask of hate. "This ain't over," he snarled. "The Reverend's right about you. You ain't natural." "I'm myself," Martha said. "Now get off my land before I forget my Christian charity." They rode off, their threats dissolving into the winter air. Martha's hands were trembling when she finally lowered the rifle. Sam was at her side in an instant. "They'll be back," he said, his voice low. "I know," she whispered. He saw the fear in her eyes then, and he realized it wasn't for herself. "It's not them I'm afraid of," she said, her voice shaking. "It's this. You. I can't let you get ruined on my account. You have a ranch, a name." He took her hands in his. They were cold as ice. "Martha, I've been a ghost for 8 years, a dead man walking. Since that storm, since you opened that door, I've felt alive. That's worth more than any ranch." Tears welled in her eyes, turning them from gray stone to silver. "I'm scared, Sam. Not of them. I'm scared of feeling again." "So am I," he admitted, his voice thick. "But maybe being scared together is better than being safe and alone." He saw the truth of it in her eyes, the same truth he felt in his own hollow chest. They weren't two lonely people anymore. They were a fortress of two, and the siege was about to begin. But Martha was still holding on to her secret. The real reason the Reverend wanted her gone. A secret buried under 7 years of grief and dirt. And Sam had a feeling that when that secret came out, it would be more dangerous than any pack of men. That Sunday, the whole town of Copper Creek was packed into the small church. Reverend Dalton was in the pulpit, his face flushed with righteous fury. He was talking about the sanctity of marriage, the wickedness of the flesh, the dark path of solitude. Every word was a stone aimed at the woman on the mountain. The congregation murmured their agreement. The women fanned themselves. The men nodded grimly. They were a mob, being sharpened to a fine point. Then the church doors creaked open. A collective gasp went through the room. Martha Brennan walked in. She wasn't dressed in her usual drab work clothes. She wore a simple gray dress, the one she saved for trips to town. Her hair was neatly tied back. She looked respectable. But that wasn't the most shocking part. Walking right beside her, his shoulders set and his jaw firm, was Samuel McKenna. They walked down the aisle together, the whispers ceasing as they passed, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. They didn't take a seat in the back. They walked right up to the front pew and sat down, their eyes fixed on the Reverend. Dalton faltered. His sermon sputtered to a halt. He stared at them, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. The town was watching. He had to regain control. "We are here," he boomed, his voice finding its rhythm again, "to speak of the bonds of holy matrimony, a bond that protects a woman, that guides her, that keeps her from the temptations of a solitary life." His eyes bored into Martha. It was a challenge, an accusation. Martha stood up. The church went so quiet you could hear the snow melting outside. Her voice when she spoke was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the room, clear and steady. "Reverend, you speak of marriage." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "I do, Mrs. Brennan, as a sacred shield against sin." "Then you will be pleased to know," Martha continued, turning slightly to face the stunned congregation, "that I am here to embrace that sacred shield." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Then she turned to the man standing beside her. "Mr. McKenna has asked me to be his wife, and I have accepted." The gasp that ripped through the church was like a physical blow. Sam felt the shockwave hit him, but he didn't flinch. He hadn't known she was going to do this. But the moment the words left her mouth, he knew it was the only move they had left. It was a checkmate. He stood up beside her, placing a hand gently on her arm. "That's right," he said, his voice a low rumble that backed her play. "We ask that you marry us, Reverend, next Sunday." Dalton's face turned a shade of purple. He was trapped. He had preached about the necessity of marriage for a woman like Martha. He had whipped the town into a frenzy over it. How could he refuse to perform the very act he claimed was God's will? He sputtered, his holy righteousness collapsing into stunned rage. But the town wasn't looking at him anymore. They were looking at Sam and Martha. They saw two respectable, grieving people, finding solace in each other. They saw a solution, not a scandal. The tide of public opinion, so easily swayed, was turning. Dalton saw it too. He was losing his mob. A sickly smile spread across his face. "Of course," he said, the words dripping with false piety. "Of course. What a joyous occasion. This community will be honored to witness such a blessed union." But Sam saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't joy. It wasn't blessings. It was the cold, calculating look of a man who had just been outmaneuvered, but who was already planning his next attack. This wasn't over. They had won the battle. But the Reverend was going to make damn sure they lost the war. The week leading up to the wedding was the quietest Copper Creek had been in months. The whispers died down, replaced by a buzzing anticipation. The marriage of the mountain ghost and the hard luck rancher was the biggest event the valley had ever seen. But for Sam and Martha, it was a week of strange tension. They were getting married, a marriage born of necessity, a shield against the town's malice. But as they worked together at Sam's ranch, preparing for her to move down from the mountain, something else began to grow in the silence between them. He watched her move around his kitchen, a room that had been empty of a woman's touch for 8 long years. She set her bundles of dried herbs on the windowsill, and the whole house began to smell like her mountain cabin, like home. She was strong, capable, and had a quiet wit that surprised him. She watched him, too. She saw the way he was gentle with the horses, the way his hands, though rough, could skillfully mend a broken harness. She saw the deep well of sadness in his eyes, but she also saw a strength that matched her own. They were two halves of a whole, broken by life, and now, maybe, being pieced back together. The night before the wedding, they sat at his kitchen table, the silence comfortable for the first time. "This is a lie, you know," she said softly, not looking at him. "This marriage. It's a practical solution," he replied, his voice just as quiet. "And after? When the town finds something new to gossip about? When Dalton is run out of town or moves on? What then?" The unspoken question hung between them. "Is this just for show?" Sam reached across the table and took her hand. Her skin was rough from work, but her hand fit in his perfectly. "I don't know, Martha," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "But for the first time in 8 years, I find myself looking forward to tomorrow. Whatever it brings." A single tear tracked its way down her cheek. "I buried my heart on that mountain, Sam, with my family." "I know," he said. "Mine is buried just down the road in the church cemetery. He squeezed her hand. Maybe, maybe we're not bearing them again. Maybe we're just planting something new. See what grows. The day of the wedding arrived, cold and bright. Martha walked down the aisle of the small church in the same simple gray dress. In her hands she carried not flowers, but a small clutch of winter berries and pine. Sam stood at the altar, his heart hammering in his chest. This felt more real, more terrifying than his first wedding. That had been the hopeful promise of youth. This was a desperate gamble made by two wounded survivors. Reverend Dalton stood before them, his face a pious mask that didn't quite hide the triumphant glint in his eyes. Jed Hawkins and Roy Patterson stood near the door, their arms crossed. They weren't guests, they were guards. Dalton began the ceremony, his voice echoed in the silent church. But when he got to the vows, he paused. Before we join this man and this woman in holy matrimony, he said, his voice taking on a hard, righteous edge, there is the matter of cleansing. A new life must begin on a clean slate. He turned his gaze on Martha. Mrs. Brennan, your life of solitude has been a subject of concern. To show your commitment to this new, proper life, to show that you are leaving your past behind. The church asks for a gesture of faith. A cold dread washed over Sam. This was it, the trap. What gesture? Martha asked, her voice steady. Dalton smiled, a predator's smile. The deed to your mountain property, a donation to the church, a tithe to wash away the sin of your past and bless this new union. The entire town held its breath. He wasn't just trying to shame her. He was trying to rob her. And now Sam understood. It was never about her being alone. It was never about sin. It was always about the land. But why? What was on that mountain that this preacher wanted so badly he would destroy a woman's life to get it? The church was silent. Every eye was on Martha. Give up your land, the preacher was saying. Give up your home, your fortress, the last piece of your old life, and I will grant you a new one. It was a devil's bargain. Sam felt Martha's hand tremble in his. He saw the flicker of despair in her eyes. She had fought so hard for so long, and now she was cornered. But then he saw something else rise in her gaze. Not fear, not defeat. Rage. Pure, cold, mountain rage. She took a step forward, her voice ringing out like a hammer on an anvil. My land is not for sale, Reverend, and my soul is not for sale either. Dalton's pious mask slipped, his face contorted in fury. You defy the will of God. You are an unrepentant sinner. The only sinner I see in this church, Sam's voice boomed, stepping in front of Martha, shielding her, is a greedy charlatan hiding behind a Bible. Seize them, Dalton shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. They profane this holy house. Roy Patterson and Jed Hawkins started forward from the doors, their faces lit with ugly excitement. The trap had been sprung, but they had underestimated their prey. Sam had spent his life dealing with stubborn cattle and hard men. He didn't back down. He met Roy's charge head-on, a lifetime of grief and anger fueling his fists. The church erupted into chaos. Men shouted, women screamed. Jed Hawkins lunged for Martha, but she was ready. She swung her small bouquet of pine and berries, the tough, thorny branches raking across his face. He staggered back, howling. It was a desperate, ugly brawl at the foot of the altar. Sam was holding his own against Roy, but more of Dalton's men were joining the fray. They were going to be overwhelmed. And then a new voice cut through the din. That's enough! The crowd parted. Tom Harper stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terrible dawning horror. He had been watching from the back, a silent, conflicted observer. But he wasn't silent anymore. Leave them be, Dalton, he shouted. The Reverend turned on him, his face a mask of rage. You dare to side with this witch? She's not a witch, Tom's voice cracked. And it wasn't a fever. The fighting stopped. Every single person in the church froze, turning to look at Tom. Martha stared at him, her heart stopping in her chest. What did you say? She whispered. Tom looked at Martha, and his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was painful to see. "It wasn't a fever that took your family, Martha," he said, his voice choked with guilt. "I was there. I was with James when he found it." "Found what?" Sam demanded, breathing heavily. "The silver," Tom whispered, the word falling like a death sentence into the silence. "A rich vein, right by the spring on your land. James was going to register the claim. He was going to be the richest man in the valley." He pointed a shaking hand at the Reverend. "But Dalton found out. He and his cronies. They wanted it for themselves. They tried to buy James out, but he refused." Tom took a ragged breath, the confession tearing out of him. "So they poisoned your well, Martha. A slow poison, from a root Dalton knew about. It looked just like a mountain fever. Fast-acting. Deadly." The truth hit the room like a physical blow. Murder. Cold-blooded and calculated. Martha's family hadn't died. They had been executed. Her 7 years of grief, her isolation, her reputation as the crazy woman on the mountain. It had all been a lie, constructed by the man in the pulpit to hide his crime. He hadn't wanted to drive her away because she was a sinner. He wanted to drive her away so he could take the silver that was soaked in the blood of her family. The confession hung in the air of the church, thick and poisonous. Reverend Dalton's face had gone ashen. The mask of piety was gone, replaced by the naked, cornered look of a rat. "Lies!" he shrieked, his voice thin and high. "The ramblings of a madman." But no one was listening to him anymore. The townspeople were looking at him with dawning horror. They were remembering the suddenness of the Brennan family's fever. They were remembering Dalton's obsessive sermons about Martha's land. The pieces were clicking into place, and they were forming a gallows. Martha stood as if turned to stone, the world collapsing around her. Her 7 years of mourning had been for a lie. The guilt she carried, wondering if she could have done more, if her herbs could have saved them. It was all a lie. They hadn't been taken by God. They had been stolen by the devil standing at the altar. A low animal sound escaped her throat. She launched herself at Dalton, not with fists, but with the fury of a she-bear defending her dead cubs. She was a whirlwind of grief and vengeance. Dalton stumbled backward, tripping over the altar steps, falling in a heap of black cloth and hypocrisy. Jed Hawkins and Roy Patterson, seeing their master fall and the tide of the entire town turning against them, made a break for the door. But the men of Copper Creek, who just minutes before had been part of Dalton's mob, now formed a wall. They were ranchers and farmers, men who understood land and family and justice. And they had been played for fools by a murderer. They fell on Hawkins and Patterson with a righteous fury that was terrifying to behold. Sam went to Martha, gently pulling her back from the cowering wreck of Reverend Dalton. He held her as 7 years of unshed tears finally broke free, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to tear her apart. He just held on, a solid anchor in the storm of her rediscovered grief. The sheriff, who had always been a bit too friendly with the Reverend, arrived to find a scene of utter chaos. But the story was clear on every face in that church. He clapped the irons on Dalton, Hawkins, and Patterson, his face grim. Justice, swift and terrible, had finally come to Copper Creek. As they dragged the Reverend away, he looked back at Martha, his eyes filled with pure, unadulterated hate. "It's not over," he hissed, but it was. The town, shamed and horrified, surrounded Martha and Sam. They offered apologies, condolences, help. Martha, her face tear-streaked, but her back straight as a pine tree, just shook her head. She didn't need their pity now. She had the truth. She looked at Tom Harper, who stood alone, head bowed in shame. "You knew," she said, her voice flat. "You knew for 7 years and said nothing." "I was afraid, Martha," he whispered. "They would have killed me too." "Fear is a choice, Tom," she said, her voice cold, "and you made yours a long time ago." She turned away from him and from the town. She took Sam's hand. "Take me home," she whispered. He didn't ask which one. He knew. He took her back to his ranch, back to the house that now smelled of her herbs. The wedding had been a sham. The brawl had been a revelation. And in the ashes of it all, 2 broken people stood together, holding on as if they were the only 2 people left in the world. The secrets were out. The ghosts had been named, but the biggest question of all remained. After the storm, after the fight, after the truth, what was left? The winter that followed was a quiet one. The trial in the county seat was swift. Tom Harper's testimony, combined with the discovery of the poison root buried behind the church, was enough. Reverend Dalton and his men would never see the light of day again. The town of Copper Creek tried to make amends. They left baskets of food on the porch of Sam's ranch. They offered to help with chores. Martha accepted their offerings with a quiet dignity, but she kept her distance. Forgiveness was a currency she didn't have to spare. She and Sam lived in a strange limbo. Their marriage, the one forged in a lie to fight a lie, was legal. But they were like two strangers who had survived a shipwreck, castaways on the shore of a new life they didn't know how to navigate. They slept in separate rooms. They worked together during the day, the silence between them heavy with unspoken things. One day in early spring, as the first green shoots were pushing through the snow, Sam found her by the creek behind the house, just staring into the water. "I went back up there," she said without turning around. "To the cabin." Sam stood beside her, waiting. "I thought I would feel them there," she whispered. "James, the children. But they're not there anymore. It's just an empty house." She finally looked at him, her gray eyes clear. "My ghosts are gone, Sam." "I know," he said softly. "Mine are too." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. "The marriage certificate is in the drawer in the kitchen," she said. "We could have it annulled. No one would blame us. It served its purpose." He looked at her, at this incredible, strong woman who had walked through hell and come out the other side. He thought of his empty house, his empty life, before the storm had blown him to her door. "Did it?" he asked. "Serve its purpose?" She looked confused. "It saved my land. It exposed a killer." "Is that all it did?" He pressed gently. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him, a dawning realization in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "It did more than that." He took a step closer. He could feel the warmth of her, see the faint color rising in her cheeks. "Martha Brennan," he said, his voice husky, 7 years ago, you closed your door to the world. A few months ago, in the middle of the worst storm this valley has ever seen, you opened it for a half-dead stranger." He reached out and gently touched her cheek. "I'm asking you to keep it open. For me." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of hope. She leaned into his touch, a small, tentative gesture that was bigger than any vow spoken in a church. "The house is a mess," she said, a small, watery smile playing on her lips. "And you leave your boots by the fire." "I'll learn to pick them up," he promised. That night, for the first time, they shared a bed not as two strangers divided by a quilt, but as a man and a woman. It wasn't the passionate fire of first love. It was something quieter, deeper. It was the warm, steady glow of a hearth that had been cold for too long, finally, miraculously, rekindled. The ghost of the mountain was gone. The hard-luck rancher was gone. In their place stood Sam and Martha McKenna, survivors, partners, a family forged not by blood, but by a blizzard, a lie, and a love that was strong enough to face down the ghosts of the past and build a future. Their story became a legend in the valley, a reminder that the fiercest storms can sometimes lead you to the safest harbor, and that even after the longest, darkest winter, spring always eventually returns. This story is a powerful reminder that things aren't always what they seem, and that the truth often lies buried beneath the surface. If you were moved by Sam and Martha's journey, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel more than you know, and ensures you won't miss our next strange and mysterious tale. Thanks for listening.